All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to our last session of the Ohio Dairy Working Group's winter Zoom series. Today we're going to be focusing on manure management. We have a whole group of educators and specialists with us here today. We're going to start off with Chris Zoller, who's over in Tuscarawas County. He's going to be talking a little bit about the fertilizer situation, fertilizer prices, which is really going to drive what some of the rest of our speakers are going to talk about the importance of manure nutrient management and planning that management. Our other speakers, we're going to have, after Chris, we're going to have Eric Rieker, who is up in Fulton County. He's going to be talking to us about some solid manure information. A lot of our dairy producers have solid and liquid manure. And some work he's been doing on comparing straight spreading of solid manure to composting that product. And then we also have with us Glenn Arnold. He's our state field specialist in manure management. And he's going to be presenting on applications of manure in the spring and utilizing that nitrogen for your corn crop. Keeping to that liquid manure side, we have a grad student with us, Chris Schaup, who's a grad student with Dr. John Fulton in Food, Ag, and Biological Engineering. He's going to be talking about, is one manure sample enough, and that variability in manure, maybe what we need to think about, and some work he's done on managing that. And then we're going to finish off with, I guess, our newest educator in the group, which is Haley Zenda, and she's in Wayne County, and going to be talking about some work has done for her graduate school and interest in manure management, maintaining that nitrogen and things. So going to hand it off to Chris Zoller to get us started. Thank you, Chris.
All right, thank you for the introduction, Jason. Appreciate everyone who's able to join today. I want to start off with just to give you an idea of some of the topics we'll hit on briefly here in this session. I want to give you an idea of as we know it today, as I know it today, the current fertilizer situation, maybe how we got there and what we might expect in terms of forecasts for pricing. Talk about some basic soil sampling and the importance of lime, and leave you with some resources that you're hopefully will find useful related to this topic. So as we think about the fertilizer situation, we look back, the points on this slide come from Farm Doc at the University of Illinois, and this was done back in October of 21. And it seems like forever ago, but we've been dealing with this fertilizer issue for quite some time. And so just some reasons for why we saw and are experiencing these increasing prices in fertilizer. If you think back to September, there was a hurricane that hit Louisiana, which caused some supply disruptions. Natural gas, which obviously is an important component of that nitrogen fertilizer production, has been going up, and natural gas and hydrous ammonia are closely related in price correlation. We've always said and known that the commodity prices, as they increase, our inputs increase. And so we see corn price go up, we're seeing fertilizer price go up. And then just everything related to this COVID that we've been dealing with for more than 2 years now. It's the supply chain interruptions, the labor issues, the trucking issues, all those things combined have kind of contributed to the current fertilizer situation. And then there's an organization called the International Fertilizer Association, and they do an outlook. And so they had an outlook that was published in August of 21, looking from 21 to 25. What have they seen, and what are they expecting to see? And so if we compare, looking at their numbers, 19 and 20 versus 20 and 21, obviously we saw increases in NP and K, and you can see those listed there, anywhere from 4% to 7% increases. They do expect that globally, this demand is going to be slower than it has been between now and 25 and 26, looking about 1% demand increase per year. So their expectation is that we won't see as rapid an increase. These are, again, from the Fertilizer Association, their numbers, looking at the first line there is 2018 and 19, and how much was consumed globally, the number of metric tons. And then 19 and 20, an estimate of what was consumed 2021 is a forecast, and looking at 25 to 26. So we see increases in each of those time periods. Now, the one thing that with these assumptions on the forecasts that are made, there's, as it shows at the bottom of the slide, a number of uncertainties, everything from weather to global economic issues, geopolitical issues, crop production. There's all sorts of things that will impact this and may change this forecast. But as it looks today, these are the kind of numbers that they're expecting to see looking into the future. And then we have this whole issue with Russia and Ukraine and what's happened there. The Fertilizer Institute came out with a news release in March, 3rd of March of this year, and said, you know, it's currently unclear how great this conflict is going to impact the situation and what ultimately will be the impact on the global market for fertilizers. But they do feel certain. I think it's safe to assume that that's going to add additional pressure on a market that's already been experiencing quite a bit of challenges. They went on to say that, you know, Russia is the second largest producer of ammonia, urea and potash, and fifth largest producer of phosphate. So a big producer, export quite a bit in terms of globally. They said that their global export market, Russia accounts for 23% of the ammonia, and you can see other percentages looking at anywhere from 10 to 21% for different commodities. And of course, this ongoing conflict in Ukraine is going to put additional stress on energy markets. Russia does supply about 1/3 of Europe's natural gas, which of course is a feedstock for nitrogen fertilizer. So, you know, it's hard to say how long this conflict is going to continue, but certainly is not helping the fertilizer situation in the US and globally. And then if we look to the future, what's something else we can look at that may give us an indication of what fertilizer prices may do? And one of those, as I mentioned earlier, is the correlation between grain price and fertilizer. And so as grain price goes up, fertilizer tends to follow. So I looked at 3 different dates, looking at corn on Chicago Board of Trade, February 18th. This was obviously prior to, but just a few days prior to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and then March the 3rd, and then again 1 week later on March the 10th, just to see what's the futures market looking at in terms of the price of corn. So you can see each of those listed there. You know, going into early March, prices did increase compared to the February date. The March 10th date, they were close, somewhat lower in many cases, but not by a whole lot compared to the March 3rd date. So bottom line is, if we assume that the Board of Trade futures markets numbers are correct, then we're probably not going to see a large decrease in fertilizer price anytime soon. So one of the things that we can do is talk about soil sampling. And it's a very basic thing, but it's a very important part of crop production and how it can help to minimize the input costs if it's done correctly. And of course, the accuracy of that is going to depend upon the quality of the sample that you send. And you're asking that soil probe to collect multiple random samples that represent a very large area. And so being random, doing it correctly, and using good quality sampling techniques is important. And then try to limit that to 25 acres or less. So consider things like areas of the field that are wet, things that are slow, different soil types. Production, you know, has one area done better than another. Why are those areas maybe lacking in production? Maybe sampling those separately and looking at those individually and seeing where you might be able to adjust some of those fertilizer rates. Really, we can sample about any time, but we try to avoid during the growing season. If we sample that in the fall, it does, especially if we need to add lime, gives us more time to apply that and allow it to react with the soil. Like have those every 3 to 4 years, and then of course follow the tri-state fertilizer recommendations have been updated and revised, and would encourage folks to follow those recommendations. One of the things that some folks, when money's tight in situations like this, we might want to skimp on that lime, but it's not the place to try to save money. That lime is critically important to make sure the pH is in the correct range and make sure that you're getting that soil sample done and then following the line recommendations for that. And this just demonstrates where we'd like to be in that 6 to 6.2 up to about 6.8, because all those things that those plants need, those nutrients those plants need, are most available at that particular range. So a lot of factors are contributing to the fertilizer price. Would encourage you, if you don't already, to get current soil samples. Talk with your agronomist, talk with your extension educator about your plans for this year, where you might be able to make some adjustments, And there are a number of resources I would encourage you to look at. And so there's the Tri-State. There have been several articles in the corn newsletter this winter that address the fertilizer issue. So I would encourage you to look at those. We do have the crop budgets, and then there is that MRTN calculator. And there was an article in the corn newsletter about that as well. So I encourage folks to look into those.
Good afternoon, Jason and everyone. Jason, can you hear me?
Loud and clear. Perfect.
Thank you. Hey, Eric Rieker, Extension Educator in Fulton County up in the northwest corner of the state. I'm going to report just a little bit on some solid manure research that we've been doing in partnership, through some grant work that was through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative or Great Lakes Nutrient and Sediment Reduction Program, which Glenn Arnold kind of got me hooked on. You'll hear from Glenn in a little bit. So make sure I can advance here. Early in 2020, or the grant was written in 2020, kind of right in the throes of COVID, and we were approved for work starting in the fall of 2020. And our goals for this project, it's a 3-year grant where we're planning to work with Holstein beef producers in Northwest Ohio. Some of you may call them integrators. And in composting pen pack cattle manure, our hope is to incentivize or encourage farmers to move their manure nutrients further, their solid manure nutrients. Do this by reducing the volume, decreasing the weight, and possibly increasing storage capacity of their manure storage barns. We also know at the same time that composting creates a more stable, nutrient dense product, and we wanted to quantify that. So our project we're right in the middle of our 21-22 kind of winter composting season. So I'm going to report on the 8 windrows that were done from 20 to 21. We worked with 5 producers and their manure storage buildings and built 8 different windrows, and not small windrows, but kind of these windrows that were 6 by 12 by 100. I think I got a slide on that eventually, but we started with 258 tons of fresh manure, and we finished up with 121 tons of finished compost. So that percentage is about 50 some percent. So we ask each producer to weigh in their manure because this is one of the most important data points, and then also weigh out. And you can see here in this video, the windrows, the HCL Compost Turner has this throat on it of 6 feet by 12 feet by 100 feet, while oftentimes the windrows were about 100 feet long. And you can kind of see the product there in my hand after we had composted for, I think this was about week 5 or turn 5. So that's just a little video of the activity. Of those 8 windrows that we built, we turned 6 of them weekly to kind of establish a baseline of what we could do with the nutrients. And then 2 of them were turned bi-weekly, kind of a paired site or a paired windrow type situation. Really critical to obviously have a compost turner. I say critical from the perspective of this work. I think you could accomplish a lot of the same things with a bucket loader or skid loader. There's some folks doing some static composting and some rototill, like in pen rototill, using a rototiller to compost. And there's lots of promise for any of those systems. In this case, we needed a tractor with a transmission that had a continuously variable transmission. And I highlight that because it doesn't matter what color. The bottom line is it had to go ultra slow on that first pass through the windrow, or through turning the windrow and mixing, especially in the case of straw-based manures. Also part of the project, we tracked temperature. We did 3 day of turning temperatures, kind of with a probe there you see on the left, a dial probe, to try and make sure that we were always between that, really 110 and 160, but the sweet spot for composting is really 120 to 140, assuming you have the right carbon nitrogen ratio. I was fortunate to work with one of the former water quality extension associates, Jordan Beck, who purchased these hobo temp loggers that you see there on the right. kind of had a sensor that you slip down a long tube, a piece of conduit right in the middle of the pile, and it kind of tracked temperature. When you run the report, the temp loggers look very similar to what you're seeing there on the right-hand side of the slide deck. And the only reason that they created a deep, fast valley was when we pulled the sensors out of the manure while we were turning, or at the day we turned, and then we'd slip them back in. And it took a little bit of time to get them back up into that 140 to, over 140 range in this case. And you can monitor these if they had an RFID tag. And so you could, if you got within 100 or 200 feet of the barn, you could kind of download the temps. So as we sampled them, I guess this slide could have gone a little bit earlier, or one slide earlier, but it's typical manure analysis. You're on a Zoom today talking about manure nutrients. Really want to encourage you as dairy farmers, any livestock producer, to sample your manure on a regular basis. We oftentimes started out in 60 to 65% moisture, and with nutrients that were available in the first year. So from A&L Great Lakes, we kind of read that far right column that identifies 8.7 pounds of total nitrogen available per ton, 6.5 pounds of P2O5, and 13.4 pounds of K2O, and 1.3 pounds of sulfur. Now, this was just one sample, but we were sampling in 3 different parts of a windrow, so 3 different spots, so we could run statistics, if you will. So my next slide is going to show you kind of the summary bar graph that I've used in other situations, a change in nutrient concentration. And I don't have a header on this slide, but it should say pounds of nutrient per ton as is. So not dried, but pounds per ton as hauled. So multiple samples in all these, some nearly 200 samples, manure samples pulled. Fresh manure started out at 66%, finished compost closer to 48% moisture. And then my statement has been, we more than doubled the nutrient density for key nutrients: phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and calcium. And so the only place we really didn't make gains was in that total nitrogen. We effectively stayed the same at 8 pounds at the start and 8 pounds in the finish completed compost, if you will. And that's because the microbes that are doing the aerobic composting process, the bacteria is using that nitrogen to process the organic matter. So, but really, for 8 pounds of 20 pounds of phosphorus, doubled the potassium, doubled the sulfur, and more than doubled the calcium. We also put together a short peach sheet for our cooperators and for our county commissioners. The chart is at the top. Another key data point was that 258 tons raw in, and we resulted in 121 tons of compost at the end. So I think that math is about 53% reduction in weight. The load reduction is probably an even more important number, because going down the road, how many fewer loads can I haul? We ask these growers, these producers, to count their loads in and out, and a 28% load reduction was realized. And that bottom gray box is actually a picture of Fulton County. The average producer, as a result of doing this composting, felt like they could haul their manure further. One of them was about a mile away, and one of them was as far as 16 miles away. And so incentivized travel, I guess, 4.5 miles further from the barn to the field. We also did some agronomic field trials comparing compost and comparing raw manure. The picture at the right was without any additional P and K. And I'm going to report on just one of those here. The corn grain trial we tried to set up it as a tri-state crop removal trial for a 2-year crop removal. And so you kind of see, I need to back up. This was posted in eFields, or published in eFields, the 2021 report. And so you can see multiples of these. I would argue that this trial, I call it the tri-state for fertilizer, manure, and compost trial, kind of compares 200 pounds of potash, 100 pounds of MAP, 50 pounds of ammonium sulfate per acre, with 10 tons of compost. And so you see the results over there. I guess I have these animated, there was no statistical difference between the manure and the compost. And similarly, because both the fertilizer and the compost have a B in next to them, there was no statistical difference between either of those. Now, there was an LSD of nearly 15 bushels. So I think other educators on this Zoom will indicate that working with manure is not a perfect science. So sometimes we get a little bit more noise in the data just because it's manure. So again, thanks to Great Lakes Commission for the grant, the 3-year grant, and I'll transfer it on to the next educator. Thanks. My contact information is in the slide.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate the lead in, and thank you, Jason, for the introduction. We're going to cover some of the possible uses of the manure, spring applied. We talk about having the 4 R's, the right nutrient, right place, right time, and right amount. Regardless of your dairy size, you're probably got plenty of manure on hand this time of year. You've had all winter to collect it. We had a fairly wet fall. We didn't get much manure hauled last year. A lot of farmers interested in getting that done this year as soon as possible, I'm sure. As Eric said, you can send in a manure for analysis pretty easily, and we encourage that. This is a dairy sample, and I want to point out that the moisture is 90.31%, and that's a little bit dry by dairy standards. Normally, when you're pumping out of one of your ponds, you're closer to about 97% water. So about every time you change this 10%, you actually double the nutrient value, because water, again, is just a filler for the most part. In this example, we have 26.55 pounds of total nitrogen in 1,000 gallons of dairy manure. And of that nitrogen, most, or a pretty good chunk, 17.24 pounds, is in the ammonium form, which means it's pretty readily taken up by crops at that form. And then in organic matter is 9.31 pounds in 1,000 gallons. And again, these are just numbers. I know that they will vary a little bit from year to year, but usually from farm to farm, farm samples their manure every year, every other year when they're hauling. You'll find those samples are relatively consistent for the most part. And then we always check out our P2O5 and our K2O numbers. And these are the same P2O5 that you buy with commercial fertilizer, the same K2O that you buy with commercial fertilizers. So again, looking at P2O5, 8.10 pounds in 1,000 gallons. So if you're applying 10,000 gallons per acre, you're putting on 81 pounds of P2O5. That's worth pretty good money when you consider the nitrogen over $1, P2O5 at probably 85 cents, and K2O close to 60 cents. And then you have a host of micronutrients. Again, most of you being veteran dairy farmers have had this. Now, when you look at places you can go with manure at this time of year, we're surface applying manure to wheat in quite a bit of Northwest Ohio today. But dairy manure doesn't really work real well on wheat. If you did put it on wheat, the wheat would love it, but I just would point out that you probably would only be putting on about half the nitrogen amount you would want to. So you would still want to come back with the half rate of urea, or 28%, or whatever you use, no matter what. I mean, I've done this, put manure on wheat a number of times in research plots, farm on-field plots, and we're always about 20 bushel lacking on yield. And it's got to be because we just don't get the right amount of nitrogen on when we're using livestock with dairy manure. Swine manure is pretty easy because it's almost all ammonium nitrogen, but the dairy seems a little slower to release regardless of what the manure tests say. If we looked at how most manure is put on corn, dairy manure in my area, it's probably this way. We simply plant the corn, and as soon as the field is planted, commercial applicators will come in and they'll splatter manure at an angle across the corn. This corn happens to be already up in the V2 stage, but we put a lot of manure on, about 10,000 gallons per acre is pretty common, right after corn is planted, because we have a lot of manure this time of year in May, and then it's an opportunity to provide moisture and a percentage of the nitrogen the corn crop's going to need. So surface application of manure to newly planted corn works out really, really well for us up here. We have done quite a bit of research over the years on how we go about side dressing corn with livestock manure. And these numbers that you're looking at we used 28% as our control. That's 200 pounds per acre, acre of side dress nitrogen is 28. And then we went in and we incorporated dairy manure at 13,500 gallons, which gave me about 135 gallons or 135 pounds of nitrogen. And then we had to add some 28 to get her up to the 200 units of nitrogen that we had with the 28 by itself. And then we did surface dairy manure, much like we do. I just showed you that video of surface application. And the only things I would point out is that over that 5-year period of time, 3 drought years, our 28 average was 142.6 bushels per acre. I'm looking at the far right-hand corner. And then if you go right below that, you'll see that knifed in dairy manure outperformed that nicely by better part of 25 bushel. And surface applied dairy manure didn't match it, but it still provided a pretty good start to the amount of nitrogen that was needed. So we would just have to supplement, knowing that we're losing nitrogen from the surface application of the manure. Now, those were pre-emergent plots. Yes, if they were done with a small tanker, and if the corn was planted on a Monday, I was in there by Wednesday applying this manure. We also came back and did post-emergent plots using a tanker. And again, we had a little bit better yield with the 28, because again, you're closer to when the corn's actually going to use it. And then when you look down through there, skip over the swine samples and just look at the dairy, again, dairy was very competitive. It beat to 28% by a nice number, even actually out yielded the swine manure ever so slightly. And again, surface applied post-emergence, we still went pretty far, but we didn't match the yields that we were after. So you would have to just know that it might take some supplemental nitrogen to reach the number you want to have. But we have a number of farmers who have modified tankers, retrofitted them in an attempt to get ways they could haul manure. Most of them have been small swine producers, but again, if you've got fields that wouldn't fit for any other better way of getting manure on, post-emergence on corn is always a possibility. Every farm would know whether it has the time and the labor to do these types of things. But that's all we're looking at here is just farmer side dressing the corn crop with manure to provide all the side dress nitrogen the crop's going to need. But you can also supplement manure with 28%. And this was an on-farm plot we did with a dairy farmer. And we knew that we were only going to get about 10 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 gallons. And with this manure tanker going down and back, we were limited to how much manure we were going to be able to put on. So this tanker covered about 0.8 of an acre on a down back 1/4 mile field, 6 rows each way. So based on what we had in the tanker from the manure, we knew how much 28 to add to it. And so we would just supplement with about 25 gallons of 28% in with the 5,000 gallons of hog manure or dairy manure, and then we would get the nitrogen we wanted. So it's possible to do. Just have somebody young enough to put up on top of the tanker and hold that 28 applicator tank. The other thing we've done a lot of is using drag hoses for side dressing corn, and we showed an earlier video of drag hosing corn. The university has 3 of these toolbars up here in our Great Lakes watershed up here in Lake Erie. And this is just one of the toolbars being run through corn at about the V4 stage, which is the very tallest we can allow corn to be. But just a farmer that's pumping directly from the manure source through the drag hose line into the ground. And he's running at a rate here of about 8,000 gallons per acre. You can just see how the drag hose goes across, and we've had really good luck with this. We've done this for a lot of years and been pretty successful with it. So we feel that it's a nice way to go. Now, if you ever look at this for their own dairies down the road, some of our farmers plant their fields at a 45-degree angle so that the commercial drag hose person can come in and follow the rows of corn. If they don't want the commercial drag hose person driving across the corn when he's surface applying, or if he wants to side dress and incorporate the manure, having the rows of corn go in the same direction that the commercial applicator wants to do is a big help. So in this instance, the commercial applicator is doing the left-hand side of this triangle he's created, then he'll switch over to the right-hand side. even though this was a square 40 when it was planted. Other way to do that, you can put a hose humper on the end of the field and put your supply line down there. And in this instance, we have a hose humper at the end of the field controlling the drag hose. And then you've got the commercial applicator going back and forth across the field, putting on the manure, doing his thing. And that hose humper just keeps the hose where it needs to be. There's just one hose humper on the far end of the field. And then the other way we do this is sometimes we'll lay the hose on the side of the field, put the hose humper guy dead center in the middle, and let the commercial applicator go back and forth. And that hose humper will just reach out and grab that hose as it comes by and hold it in place. And slowly but surely, we'll drag this hose across that field of corn. It's hard to tell here, but the corn's in about the V3 stage. That's about the size we like. When they have a collar, this is V3 corn. Each of these lower leaves has a collar and it's gripping the plant. So we think that's important to have that as a method of measurement. So when this leaf has a collar, it eventually will be V4 corn, and V4 is the limit. I would just caution you that if you work your fields in the spring, you may not be happy with how a hose drags across the cornfield. You can see where we're scouring dirt, we're shoving all the manure to a central location, and really not what you want to be doing with your drag hoses. So we just need to make sure it's a firm field, something with a no-till, cover crops, things like that. Later in the summer, you get your first cutting of hay off, you can go out there with manure in between cuttings. That's pretty commonly done. Just one way of using dairy manure during the growing season with a growing crop. And this is just a picture of somebody putting triticale down, and they're splattering manure on top of triticale after the silage has been removed. The field was worked, this was very dry. So they put that on to add moisture to boost the triticale emergence. Here's an example. It was a dry fall. Dairy farmer put down manure with a commercial manure applicator. You can see where he turned on the end, and that provided the moisture to pop that weed out of the ground. So again, those are ways you can use manure. My contact information is here. If you want to reach out to me at any time with questions about the use of dairy manure, I'll be more than happy to help you out. Thank you.
Hope everyone's doing well. My name is Chris Schaup. Thanks for that introduction. I am a grad student for John Fulton and FABI down at Ohio State. And I actually had the chance to work with Glenn Arnold, who just previously spoke while we were side dressing corn for the past 2 summers. And we ran, I'm just going to do a little bit of a project introduction and talk about some of the data we collected. Then talk about stratification, what it means during application, some of our alternative options, and then our takeaways. So with that side dressing manure that was done, we were able to use one of those applicators Glenn referenced in his presentation in Darke County. And during application there, you can see how I'm collecting manure samples. So that just allowed me to take manure samples every 15 minutes and take those to the lab and get results and feedback to reference and see how manure changes, how those nutrients stratify during application, what the change is from beginning to end, and just allowed me to depict and give clear representation of how those nutrients change during application. In this instance, I was taking manure samples every 15 minutes, and this application lasted 4.5 hours. We ran multiple tests at multiple fields. For this instance, this picture, this is a hog operation. We had different farmers that had dairy and hog manure combined. We had steer finishing floors. We had quads for hogs. And then we also had a couple of dairies that had us come out and do some of their outdoor lagoons. All of them ended up, showing that stratification. And let's go ahead and get to that. When you are trying to determine how much manure to apply to the field, there's multiple different factors that factor in. So you have your crop removal rate, you have your soil test results, and then you have your manure lab result. All of those are then used to determine how much nutrients are needed in the field to provide that crop what it needs, what is there, and then what the manure can provide. And this is a table that is, or a graph that is showing the results for one of those fields. So as you can see, from beginning to end, if we were to take one singular sample and say, this is the accurate, this is what this pit is going to provide the field all the way across the field. This graph is showing how there is some of that variation. So on your y-axis on the left, you have your NP and K, and that's pounds per 1,000 gallons. And because of the scale, I put dry matter on the right. That allows for dry matter to us to zoom in and see how NP and K respond to the changes in dry matter. So as you can see, your total nitrogen is more flat, and it does not and has less impact based on dry matter. But you can see how P2O5 and dry matter correlate very strongly, how dry matter decreases at the same point as P2O5, and they increase and decrease at the same time. Whereas both as total nitrogen and K2O are pretty consistent during application. This was one pit that was not agitated. I'll put that preface in there. We had different operations, different management styles at each location. But at this location, I just thought this was a good graph that showed how from beginning to end, you see that decrease from beginning to end of P2O5, but it's pretty consistent for total N across the field. And then it drops off there at the end. And that's just one of those things where the variation and the stratification of nutrients is very volatile during application and pretty unpredictable. So I'm going to touch again just on that agitation aspect and how that is a potential option for stratification depending on your location, kind of the conditions on the day of pumping. On a really still day, some of those gases can be very dangerous. And for that reason, they're less agitation is relied on, especially in confinement operations. But even around lagoons, if it's a really still day and there's no air moving, you can be at risk or put some people at risk or animals at risk. But for instance, in pits 2 and 5, those operators and managers decide that, it was worth it for them to go ahead and agitate during application. And you can see that consistency that resulted in both P2O5 and total nitrogen. They were able to distribute that dry matter more evenly throughout the manure profile, allowing them to get a more even application. But then you can also see how there was still some variation from beginning to end, a little bit of a drop off in your pit 2 and your P2O5. But then for those that were not agitated, you see the variation much more clearly. So here is where I took grab samples, and those would be your gold and red lines. So those are pit samples. So your dotted lines are the manure result that the farm manager and owner had collected and taken in prior to any application. So they took that lab result, they determined and used that to determine the application rate they wanted to apply. And based upon that rate, you can see how the nutrients varied from beginning to end of application. And you can see how for your total nitrogen, you can see how only at the beginning, that very first application of that hog manure, you can see how it started to fall off and peter off till the end. Even though this pit was agitated, there was still a little bit of a decrease over time. And that's a big difference when you look at your axis, your vertical axis there on the left. This is only pounds per 1,000 gallons. So during application, you can see how a change in 10 pounds for total nitrogen if you're trying to apply 5,000 to 8,000 gallons, a change in 10 pounds goes all the way up from 50 to 80 pounds of nitrogen that you thought you were applying but didn't get applied. And then another scenario is look at your P2O5. At no point did that P2O5 actually hit that expected amount. It was always exceeding that. So again, if you're applying 5,000 to 8,000 pounds of manure and you're always exceeding that by 5 to 8 pounds, you're looking at 25 to 40 pounds of additional phosphorus being applied to those areas of the field. And in some places you can see there on that hog application, it was exceeding by even 10 pounds. And that's some of the unpredictable, or one of the most unpredictable aspects of manure during application, is those spikes and valleys where you can kind of create some variability across your field. So how can we kind of combat that? How can we make this process more predictable? And that's where my manure sampling came into play. So having an average and doing composite sampling is a really good opportunity. You can take, for instance, like in this graph, those dashed lines they did a composite between that steer manure and that hog manure because they were doing a mixture of the two. The steer manure there, it was so thick they had to add a little bit of hog manure in. And prior to any application, they determined that it would be best for them to do an average between those two pits, and that's where we got those dashed lines from the pit or the sample result that they took in. So by doing that composite, they have a representation of beginning and middle and end of the application the previous year. But that was only one 500 milliliter sample, even though it was composite. Maybe it was multiple samples put together. You don't get the opportunity to average then those separate results. And that's where I'm talking about in that next bullet point. Taking multiple samples during application is a great way. The law averages, you get more accurate the more samples you collect. So even if, for instance, I'll take you back 2 slides here. So if you take a look on the P2O5 slide or the P2O5 graph, if you look at pit 3 and 4, if you were to take a sample at beginning, middle, and end, you would see that change from beginning to end of the pit, and you could do an average and get a more it would be a more simplified graph than what I have, but you would be able to note that change from beginning to end. And then with both of those, both composite sampling and then multiple sample collection and getting those tested, starting to develop a data set from sampling year to year, like developing, from 2015 to 2018, if you had a sample from each of those years, you could start to compile and see how consistent your samples were from year to year. And then you could have a more accurate and do an average yearly, expected rate to apply and just see how it's changing year to year, all based on those conditions within the pit, within your feed ration, within the cycle at which you're at with the dairy, how your bedding and things of that nature change. All of that feeds into your manure and can just add to that variation. But as those change, you can kind of account for that variation through averaging year to year. That's all I have. If you have any questions, I have more information and data available to share more in depth. But thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk.
Perfect. All right. So, hey, everybody. My name is Haley Zinda. Jason introduced me earlier. I'm the new educator here in Wayne County. Been here for almost a year. And so today I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of my graduate research that I did. I finished this up last year and it actually just got accepted into the Journal of Dairy Science. So I'm really excited about that. We're looking at the effects of lowered dietary cation anion difference on the digestibility and manure characteristics of lactating dairy cows. So of course, nitrogen retention is going to be really, really important with fertilizer prices. And it's going to be that nutrient that is so easily volatilized. Now, there is already evidence that adding large amounts of sulfuric acid or urease inhibitors to a manure slurry, they're able to reduce the amount of ammonia loss from manure pits. However, it's added cost in chemicals. And then of course you need to be able to incorporate that somehow. So whether it's through mixing it in the lagoon, or if you're going to apply that during field application, it's going to be an added cost either way. So with this project, we were looking at being able to feed, or I should say, being able to biologically reduce the pH of the manure through the addition of cation anion differences, or I should say feeding more anions during the lactation period. So a negative DCAD, or a diet with more anions, are typically going to be fed during that dry period of the dairy cycle. And it's to prevent any sort of milk fever once they transition. And so then it switched to a positive DCAD, or a diet with more cations once they start lactating, just because we're meeting their nutrient requirements. However, if we're able to reduce that DCAD while they're lactating, what does that mean for the manure slurry? We already know that reducing the DCAD in the dry period should reduce urine pH and therefore manure slurry pH. But what does that mean for lactating cows? So we're trying to find that balancing act and trying to reduce the DCAD as much as possible without making it negative. So we are trying to shoot for that 0 to 10 range. But of course, there's not a lot of research out there on it. So there are instances in which reducing the DCAD from 0, or I should say between 0 and 100, is able to reduce the manure pH slurry without negatively affecting milk production, which is something we definitely don't want to do. We want to make sure that we're still keeping up production and components. But really, this graph right here that I made is the most important in getting the concept across. So I'm going to get a little bit into some chemistry here. I'll try to slow down and of course ask questions if you need help with it. But it gets kind of into the weeds. So when we're talking about typical manure pH and urine pH, it's going to be right in this 7 to 8 range. Manure pH is going to be about 7.5, and a urine from a positively DCAD fed cow is going to be about 8.5. Well, the goal is to reduce that urine pH to at least less than 7 to reduce the amount of nitrogen loss. And that's because of this right here, the pKa of ammonium. So ammonium and ammonia, they're basically analogs, and a pH of 9 is where ammonium will become ammonia and they're at equilibrium. Well, ammonium will not volatilize, but ammonia will. So when you're at a pH of 9 or above 9, ammonia will be the preferred molecule, and so you'll have a lot of nitrogen loss in that way. However, if you're below 9 and further away from the pH of 9 you go, ammonium will be preferred and less nitrogen loss will occur. Therefore, with a negative DCAD urine, that's going to be at about 6.5 ideally, and your fecal pH without any sort of urine introduced is going to be around 6. So if we're able to combine a low DCAD urine pH along with the fecal pH and keep it at least less than 7, ideally we should be able to retain more nitrogen in the manure. Whereas if we were going to be adding sulfuric acid, it would be down in that 5.5 range. And not only is sulfuric acid dangerous, but again, it increases cost through chemical and technology and equipment needed. So for this study, we were looking at 3 different diets. They each had different DCADs. The main objective of this portion of it was fiber digestibility, and then of course manure characteristics and ammonia emissions. Now there is a second half to this study, which was the milk production and lactation performance, but I'm not going to present any of that today. So the MEG anion was the feed additive that we used. It was an ammonium chloride product. And so our control diet was a DCAD of 200 Our middle DCAD diet was a DCAD of about 100, and then our low ended up having a DCAD of about 1 mill equivalent per kilogram of dry matter. So of course, how are we going to measure this? I was lucky enough to be able to collect samples from the cows and incubate for 5 days at a time. So this is our setup here. Dr. Chan-Hee Lee put these incubation stations together. Essentially, we were mixing together urine and feces from the same cow in the proportions that they would have emitted them. So some cows were producing more feces than others. Likewise for the urine, so we wanted to make sure that we were giving them the most accurate proportions we could. They stayed in these jars for 5 days, and every 30 minutes for 30 seconds over the course of 24 hours, the gas was pumped and sampled into these collection bags. And so then every 24 hours, we would change the collection bags, measure them with our Gasera machine, and it would measure our ammonia concentrations in the air. Digestibility was important because sometimes low DCAD can decrease digestibility. However, there wasn't any evidence of that. We saw dry matter and organic matter digestibilities to be about what we expected them to be, so about 65% on average. And then as far as excretion characteristics went, so we were measuring the feces pH, of course, and then the urine pH. And what's interesting about the urine pH is that it changed over time. So when we sampled the urine, we measured pH immediately after sampling, and then again after it was thawed from being stored in the freezer. So this value here, the 6.72, that's going to be the urine pH that we saw right after sampling. And it went up about half of a pH point after freezing and thawing, likely because of the buffering components and buffering capabilities in the urine itself. When we mixed the feces and urine together in their ratios, the average manure pH for our control was about 7.5, almost the same for our middle DCAD, and then for our low DCAD, it was right under 7, which is what we were shooting for. And so then after the incubation, we measured again, and you can see that the pH increased. And so then with our urine outputs, because we were feeding such drastic levels of electrolytes, our high DCAD and our low DCAD, we're going to have more urine output. We didn't exactly expect that with our low, but luckily we had some research and other literature to back it up. But this is, of course, what we are looking at the most, and this is what we are most hopeful for. This graph illustrates the amount of ammonia loss per cow per day over a 6-day incubation. So day 0, of course, we didn't have anything measured. And day 1, unfortunately, was the only day where we saw an actual difference between the 3 treatments. This was contrary to several other projects that had been done in our lab, where they were able to see actually a 40% decrease in ammonia loss with different DCAD strategies. However, this only equated to be about a 15% decrease. So overall, for the 6-day incubation, there was no difference among treatments. Well, why was there the lack of statistical difference apart from what we were expecting? So our fecal to urine ratio ended up being greater than 2 to 1. Typically, it should be a little bit less than that. And with a greater proportion of feces in the mix, it has an increase of organic buffers. So the manure, or I should say in the manure, the ability for ammonia to volatilize is the fact that there are microbes that produce urease, which lyses urea in the urine, which then can go to ammonium and ammonia. So we attributed it to that. There was also that urine pH that increased after storage. Urine has its own buffering capacity. And then that manure output is going to be quite variable between the cows. It ranged between 54 and 101 kilograms, which is quite a difference, which of course then led to that range in fecal to urine ratios. So in conclusion, DCAD did not affect digestibility as we expected. And we also saw that urine output is altered with the inclusion of chloride. So in that ammonium chloride product, and then ammonia manure loss may be reduced with smaller fecal to urine ratios, but more research needs to come out on that yet. In vitro, it's a great idea, but once you get it in vivo and try it on the cows, it's just definitely not what we were expecting it to be. But with that, thank you for listening. There's my contact info. You can always find me here in Wayne County.